Dearan. I'm Director of Reform Scotland, and welcome to this fascinating discussion, I hope and I believe, about the future and no doubt the past and the present of the civil service, both in London and Edinburgh. I think it's safe to say that modern times have not been overly kind to an institution that was once regularly described as the Rolls Royce of government. The past few decades have not been short of political disruption and change, and they've really opened up the civil service to greater scrutiny and controversy than it's perhaps been used to, but the same is probably true of every British institution I can think of. There have been various efforts to reform the civil service over the years, not always with a great deal of success. There have been attempts to change its leadership, its method of operating, the kinds of people who join it, even where it's based. And most recently and noisily, of course, during the short-lived tenure of Dominic Cummings at 10 Downing Street, with his demand that super talented weirdos join up. I must say, in my experience, that description fits a fair few of those already in the job, but obviously not weird enough for Cummings. In the end, I think Cummings' hard rain that was going to fall on Whitehall didn't really happen. In fact, it was described by Peter Hennessy as little more than a refreshing shower. But that doesn't mean that change isn't needed. We know it's now not uncommon for permanent secretaries to be moved on by their political masters if their face doesn't fit, whether that's in Downing Street or the Home Office or the Education Department, the Foreign Office, whatever. Mandarins are openly criticised by politicians and in the media in ways that they perhaps weren't in the past. They've variously been described as obstructive, as out of date, not fit for purpose, of lacking expertise, and they've been caught up in a number of public scandals such as Partygate, the Alex Salmond affair up here, from which they've not always emerged with great credit. So there are undoubtedly some truths in the criticisms, but it also seems to me like we should have some empathy for those who have tried to wrestle with the agendas of recent governments, whether that's around Brexit or climate change or devolution or public sector reform, the financial crisis and now the cost of living crisis, COVID, the tech revolution, it goes on and on. These are big tangled issues without simple answers, and sometimes maybe the agenda brought to them by politicians has lacked coherence and clarity, which doesn't make it easy for civil servants to then deliver policy. Sometimes it even changes from day to day, depending on the Prime Minister. We know that civil servants can make easy scapegoats for their master's political failures. But the world has also undeniably shifted in, I think it's about 170 years or something like that, since the Northcote Trevelyan report that established the civil service. It's changed and is changing comprehensively and quickly in the 21st century too, and it seems clear that the civil service needs to move with the times more than it already has to this point. So today we're going to look at these issues and others, including whether we get the civil servants we need, whether we use the ones we have as effectively as we could, whether they are accountable enough, and in that context, what does accountability mean? What does enough mean? I should say that in my conversations with former and existing civil servants, there's pretty much always an acknowledgement that further reform is needed. So it's not a sort of conversation of the deaf here. We have a genuinely first-rate panel with us today, comprising some old friends and some new faces. In no particular order, we have Philip Rycroft, former Permanent Secretary of the Department for Exiting the European Union and Director General in the Cabinet Office. We have Sarah Davidson, former Director General for Organisational Development and Operations at the Scottish Government, now Chief Executive of the Carnegie Trust. We have Paul Gray, former Chief Executive of NHS Scotland, now Visiting Professor at the University of Glasgow and much else besides. And Alex Thomas, who is a Programme Director at the Marvellous Institute for Government, which does some really important and serious thinking around this issue as well as others. So welcome to you all, and thanks so much for your time today. We're going to have a chat and then we'll take questions from the audience. And I know this is a subject that interests all of you. It's the reason you're here, but also that it does get the passions going. So I do hope you'll get involved and have your say. And please send me your questions using the chat button on your Zoom screen, and we'll get to the best ones before the end, I hope. But I want to start with a very basic question, because I think there is quite a lot of public misunderstanding about the answer to this. And that question is, what is it that civil servants do? And what is it that they don't do? What is the breakdown of responsibilities and duties? And what do we have a right to expect from them? I think, Sarah, did you want to lead off with taking that on for us?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I'm happy to lead off, and I'm very happily to stand corrected by others or amplified by others afterwards. So I suppose at its most basic, the role of the civil service is to help ministers and the elected government of the day to turn their political vision and their manifesto commitments into reality, and also to deliver a lot of public services. They are politically impartial and accountable to ministers, and we can maybe come back and unpack a bit later what that means. The Home Civil Service, which is a term of art, includes staff of all the UK government departments and executive agencies, and also the staff of the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government. And in practice, day-to-day leadership and management is devolved to the Scottish Government and the Welsh Government. And those civil servants, importantly, are accountable to their ministers rather than to UK ministers. I think it's also quite important to make the point that the vast majority of civil servants, I think about 70% in the UK, are serving in the big 5 UK government departments, which are focused on frontlining citizen service delivery. And also to make the point that the civil service is not a homogeneous group. And I think often there's a misunderstanding from outside that it is. In fact, it's broken up into about 15 or 16 different professions. And that operational delivery profession, the external facing one, makes up about 50% of the totality of the civil service. And others are in the technology profession, the policy profession, the commercial and procurement profession. There's lots of separate professions who have their own expertise and who help to support ministers and support the elected government in different ways. That question of, what is the role and function? Clearly, the operation of government requires lots of different roles and functions, and I think thinking about the professions is quite a good way of thinking about that. And there are many operational decisions that are delegated day in, day out to civil servants. And indeed, in the role that I had last in the Scottish Government, I had delegated responsibility for many operational decisions. But ultimately, the decision makers are government ministers. And I guess that brings me on to your question about what do you not do as a civil servant. You don't frustrate agreed policy that you don't like. You don't throw your toys out the pram if you don't like the decision that a minister took, irrespective of what your advice was. You don't express your personal, and by that I mean your non-professional views about policy or about operations. And you don't express your views about the merits or otherwise of policy in a personal sense. You might talk about it in the privacy of your own home, and you certainly exercise your right to cast a ballot like anybody else does. But the separation between your personal view and your professional view is an important one. And maybe critically to end on, you don't do anything that compromises your ability to serve a government of a different complexion with equal energy and commitment.
Mm-hmm. I wonder whether that last point you were talking about, how you approach, advising on policy and whatever, not letting your personal views in, but in the combative political climate we've had recently, say for the last decade, referendums and policies that split the country down the middle, we've also seen probably more clashes, maybe the wrong word, but disputes between the civil service and ministers that have ended up in, being investigated, or people moving, or people resigning, or whatever. So it clearly, the ideal might be that you just dispatch your duties and then move on to the next thing. But that, in practice, there are times that doesn't happen. And advisors advise, ministers decide. But there must come points where we've seen people demand a written direction recently from people because they don't think that the policy necessarily has an economic justification or whatever it would be. How far can you go as a civil servant when you think that a policy is clearly wrong, not necessarily from a personal perspective or your own biases, but actually you could see that it's not going to achieve what the minister thinks it will achieve? How far can you push them? And famously, of course, you get the Yes Minister thing of Whitehall, managing to divert things or move them into the slow lane if they think it's something that isn't necessarily good for the country. And I'm sure there is some truth in that. It's been said too many times in the past. But so how does it work when you are up against something that you're just really unsure about?
So there is help there in the form of very clear responsibilities that are held by accountable officers, and in the Scottish Government those are held both by the Permanent Secretary and by Directors General. They're held by Permanent Secretaries in Whitehall departments. And that confers a very direct responsibility for which actually you are accountable to Parliament rather than to your ministers, for what's called the regularity, propriety, value for money and feasibility of a proposal. And as an accountable officer, you have to satisfy yourself of those things. And as you say rightly, Chris, if you can't satisfy yourself of those things, then you can ask for a ministerial direction. And I think one of the interesting ones that we saw recently that was, I mean, they're all published, but the one that got quite a lot of attention recently was Matthew Rycroft's letter to the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, in relation to the Rwanda dispersal policy. And actually, it's worth a read directly, because what it says is slightly different from what the media reported it as saying. It sets out clearly those things on which he was able to satisfy himself, and those things in relation to value for money on which he was not able to satisfy himself. But it also states really clearly the fact that it is the Home Secretary's legitimate right to say, thank you for your advice, I hear you, but nonetheless, I am of the view that this is in line with government policy and I'm going to go ahead with it. And all of that is entirely transparent to Parliament, to the National Audit Office. I suppose it's probably also worth saying that the threat of a direction is probably something which almost invariably is more behind the scenes, but a helpful way of making clear to a minister that there are tests there and that there are options which can be taken to avoid having to press that kind of nuclear button. And I know there's been a bit of interest recently in the number of directions that there have been or have not been sought in the Scottish Government in recent years, but I don't think anyone should take that to assume there haven't been discussions about the possibility of a direction. So I suppose that's your big stick, as it were.
Yeah, okay. And I presume as well you've all had experiences where you have perhaps recommended against a course of action and not been listened to, and then quite enjoyably watched it all go wrong as the minister goes down the route. And I'm sure you're far too discreet to tell us about that. Philip, you had your hand up there.
Yeah, maybe just to add to that, it's not just about the sort of occasions where, as accountable officer, you've got to account for expenditure of public money, which is where directions generally kick in. It's also about the advice that is given to ministers on the direction of policy that they're pursuing. The critical thing here is that the civil service, so that's north or south of the border, is able to give that advice without fear or favour, that it does, in the terms, speak truth unto power, and it gives the full, it doesn't, as it were, tailor the advice in the expectation of what ministers might want to hear. And maybe just let me give you an example of that. It's quite a big example, but one I was sort of intimately associated with it, which was the work we did on no-deal Brexit. And now clearly there were those ministers in the government at the time who thought that no-deal Brexit was a legitimate outcome of Brexit and wanted to preserve the possibility of that as part of the negotiating suite of things. My job in the Department for Exit in the EU was to make sure they understood to the fullest extent the risks around a no-deal Brexit, of which there were many. And we worked very hard at that. We worked hard at it against quite a lot of pushback, but we reached a point where, to my satisfaction, we got a paper in front of the cabinet, as it turned out, which set out our analysis of those risks and of other departments in full. And that, I thought, was the civil service doing its job properly. This wasn't about us being Remainers. It was about analysing the situation honestly, impartially, and giving that advice to ministers. Sarah says, up to them what they did with that advice. The important thing was that they got it.
Okay. Alex, I saw some movement from you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, very interesting. I agree with what both Sarah and Philip said there. I think it's interesting. I mean, I was a civil servant in the UK government in London until 2 and a bit years ago. And it's interesting what 2 years, how 2 years out of the civil service changes your perspective on some of these things, because I certainly my experience inside government was the directions were considered awkward, difficult, sometimes quite painful processes. Actually, looking at it from the outside, I think my views changed a little bit on that, which is that we should have more ministerial directions. They should be more normalised in a way, because they are a perfectly good, effective way of clarifying accountability for decision making. So I think there's something quite healthy about that exchange. And I agree with Sarah. Read the Matthew Rycroft letter, and you can see actually a very kind of calm exposition of where there's a reasonable grounds for policymaking, for taking a decision, but also where there's a lack of evidence on value for money, because Priti Patel is relying on a deterrence effect of the Rwanda scheme where the evidence just doesn't exist. And that seems to me to be quite a healthy sort of exchange where Priti Patel is taking on board the accountability for that decision and prevents that then kind of ambiguity and tussle between civil servants and ministers, blame games and so on. I mean, Chris, final thought on that is you win the prize for the first Yes Minister reference, obviously, but I think there's something really. Yes Minister frames so much of this discussion, sometimes in a humorous way, but I think it pervades, and it gets something really seriously wrong, I think, about the relationship between ministers and civil servants, and that's where the power is. In Yes Minister, Sir Humphrey has all the power, and he's the conniving one who's diverting things and preventing things from happening. In reality, ministers have the power, and civil servants are, if anything, too keen to demonstrate their fealty to ministers and too loath to do the direction thing. So I think there's an interesting sort of reflection on the power dynamic there that Yes Minister gets wrong. So I wanted to lob that one in early.
It must also be the case, though, that I'll take this government as an example, because it is an obvious example of administrations that come in and try to do quite maybe extreme, some quite extreme things, highly politicized, dividing line creating policies that are more political than they are, necessarily because they've been thought through and they think it'll make a difference to the country. And in that situation, if you're a civil servant, you're probably a bit more wary about covering your back, I guess, especially, you get these dead cats getting thrown on the table every other week when Boris has got himself into trouble and they need to get away from that. So do you think that's one of the reasons that actually more directions are not necessarily a bad thing, because it does give civil servants a way to say,
yes, I agree with that. And I also think one of the really difficult things for the civil service at the moment and over the last few years is it's actually quite easy if you've got ministers who are signed up to, as for the first part of my career, evidence-based policymaking, and it's all about evidence-based policymaking. The Blairite, what matters is what works. Actually, there's a harmonious space there for you might have whatever personal relationships or tensions day to day, but that's quite a kind of aligned position where a civil servant and a minister can put themselves side by side and work out what works, and then in service of the government's policy, and then do it. Mm-hmm. If you're in an environment where evidence is less highly valued, or the objective is to set out a particular political position to make a case, rather than pursue a policy that has full evidential backing, that's clearly less comfortable for civil servants, and that's where the directions come in.
Yeah, fair enough. I'll just move on from this at the moment. I have a few things to get through, but Paul, I'm interested in why it has proven so hard to change the civil service over the years. Lots of people have tried it, but it's such a vast and complex system. It's got an old embedded culture and way of doing things. And as with other professions, those within it can be very protective of their traditions and their fiefdoms. But what's your view of whether the civil service, how far has the civil service been modernised, and how much further does it have to go? And why is it so difficult to bring the changes that almost everyone I speak to, both within and outside the civil service, agrees are needed?
So I joined the civil service in 1979. And it depends how long a telescope you're using. I can tell you it's exceedingly different from what it was then. And mostly, not all, in a good way. Our approach to diversity is night and day. We're not anywhere near where we should be yet, but we've come a long way. I don't have a degree. I left school and went to work on a farm and joined the civil service as a pay clerk. And I didn't do the things that people think you do in order to get to the top. Other people did, and they were successful too. But there is actually more embracing of diversity of experience than is maybe visible on the face of it. how difficult is it to change? I think it is hard, but I think that being specific and clear about what it is you want to change is really important, and focusing on that. So generalizing from the particular doesn't really work. So Dominic Cummings, who said a number of things that made sense, by the way, he wasn't all wrong about everything. But, you know, he said he once met a civil servant going home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. That meant they all did. You know, so that sort of generalization, if the last time I went home at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you know, I have long forgotten. I can't recall that it ever happened. I did drive home once in the daylight in about 1997, but that was about it. So, but that could all sound defensive. My point is, what is it that really needs to change? What would make a difference to the lives of the citizens of the country that you're here to serve? Because these are the things that should really change. The things that need to change, as I've said, are diversity. We've come a long way, but when you're recruiting, you're still, I mean, you know, one of the recruitments I've been overseeing recently, we've still got an all-male shortlist. Now that's 1 out of 20, but you know, that is still sometimes happening. Our diversity in relation to the populations of different cities is ill-matched, to put it mildly. So there's a lot of room for improvement, because what you get from that diversity is diversity of experience, diversity of view, diversity of perspective, and we're not as good at including that as we should be. I'm saying we as though I was a civil servant. I haven't been one since 2019. What else needs to change? I think the idea that you made the point about accountability, the idea that civil servants are not accountable. What would be really good to understand, and I mean, I think all of us will have had experience of it, what would accountability look like in a way that would actually be meaningful to the citizens of the country? When would they feel that civil servants were accountable? Because if, as Sarah and others have explained, if civil servants are to be held accountable for what ministers decide, you're actually undermining the democratic process. You're basically saying you're going to give more power to the people you didn't elect than you are to the people you did. And that just seems to me to be plain wrong. The power should ultimately rest with the people that the country elected. So I've half answered your question, but I think it's about being precise about what we want to change and really focused on that, not generalizing from the particular, and making sure that the power rests with the people who are elected to hold it.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Sarah.
Chris Gregor, so I'm sure Alex will have things he'll want to say about accountability, because I know he's been working on that recently, but I just wanted to draw a distinction in the change space between some of the changes that have taken place in the Scottish civil service, for the want of a better term, and the UK civil service in recent years. And I know a lot more about the former, obviously. But I do think that post-1999, there was a very strong emphasis in Scotland, and it has become increasingly strong in the last maybe 15 years or so, a very strong emphasis on civil servants working in the Scottish government having much stronger connections with the organisations, the people, the sectors, and actually citizens as well, in order to try and ensure that advice to ministers on policy was much better informed by an understanding of how all that plays out. Now, much as Paul was saying about diversity, still a long way to go. And I think some of the intensity of what's happened for government in recent years has probably taken a foot off the pedal of that a bit. But there's no doubt that, you know, I joined the civil service a long time after Paul did, but still thinking about the change that I saw in my time from when I started in 1995 to when I left a few years ago. It was pretty rare for a lot of people to really ever even leave government buildings. And certainly post-devolution, and particularly in the last decade, the expectation that ministers have, quite rightly, of their officials, that they are out and about, understanding what's going on, trying to get a feel of it, is really night and day. And I think that's an important element of the change. And I know it's something that Whitehall has tried to give effect to as well. The London-centric nature of policymaking makes that harder south of the border, but it's still an intention.
Alex, did I see you?
Yeah, thank you. Just, I mean, 2 quick points on, and sorry, I've been chucked out of the room I was in. I've lost my nice books behind me, so in the prison cell down here.
You've lost about 50 IQ points as a result.
Yeah, exactly. But at least you got to see them. On sort of civil service reform and then accountability, but really briefly, on civil service reform, clearly, a lot has changed, I suppose, and talk about, functional model and more professional commercial project management skills and expertise in the civil service and so on. So there's lots of things have changed, but in terms of the sort of process of reform, what's really striking to me is just how much, although the civil service has both changed a lot and the reform, the areas for reform and change are remarkably similar. So you go back to reports that came out in the 1960s, the 1980s, 1990s, they all talk about the same things. They talk about too many people moving around Whitehall and not having the expertise. I can see there's stuff in the chat on that. They talk about too many generalists and not enough expert managers or other specialists. They talk about London being too London-centric and all of those things. So that doesn't mean that any of those are wrong or that they haven't been done. It's just this same themes for any huge organization, more than an organization, a whole sector really, are going to come up again and again and again. And to make change actually happen requires persistence and political engagement as well as administrative engagement and time. So Dominic Cummings coming in and firing off a blog about misfits and weirdos, he can force a gang of very senior civil servants out of their jobs, but he can't actually change the system. You need a Francis Maud-like figure to compare, who was very challenging to the civil service at the time, but who stuck at it for 5 or 6 years to actually make changes happen. On I said it'd be brief and I haven't, but on accountability, I think there is something really. I completely agree with Paul that you need democratic control over the decisions that are made. But I think that can be consistent with checks, balances, mechanisms that ask ministers to think twice, a sort of institutional bulwark, if you like. So I think that's one of these things that there's an assumption that the civil service can provide some of that bulwark, but it's not really equipped to do so because it's directly under the control of ministers. So I think, and I won't go on too long about it, but there's something we can do better in UK government and in the Scottish government about building up the confidence and the institutional strength of the civil service, which is consistent with democratic oversight, but not a sort of pure, the public's voted for X, therefore X is what must happen without challenge or testing. Anyway, we can get more into that if people are interested.
Okay, Philip. As Alex mentioned there, some of the same things keep coming back, but we should touch on some of them because obviously people in the audience maybe won't have as good a grasp of them as you guys do. And one of the regular criticisms is churn, that civil servants move regularly from job to job and department to department, perhaps every other year. So one moment you're working on British policy in South America and the next you're dealing with motorway tolls or whatever it can be. And that idea of the generalist who can turn their hand to anything feels a bit sort of as if it belongs to the age of empire and not necessarily in the age of technology where maybe more specific skills are needed. Should people be asked to stay in jobs for longer and build up their expertise in a single area and almost make a career of it? Is there still a value to this sort of hopping around from place to place?
Almost certainly people should stay in their jobs longer. I say that as somebody who the longest I ever did in a job was 4 years when I was running the schools directorate in the Scottish government with a rather brilliant minister who happens to be on the call, I think, Peter Peacock. And we had 4 years and Peter was there for most of that, where we could get stuff done. And I sort of built up my expertise in education, had a good team around us. But it's worth remembering, for all that I did 4 years in that job, we were dealing with folk in the educational system for whom this was their professional life, who would be doing it for 25, 30, 40 years. I was never going to know as much as those people. My skill was, if you like, as Sarah described it, as being a gearing mechanism between what ministers wanted and that world of expertise. So part the job of the civil servant and again, as Sarah's described, the way the Scottish Government's tried to do this is that connective tissue into the deeper public sector, understanding how those systems operate, being empathetic with those systems, so that when you're advising ministers, you can say, if you want to procure that change, this is the best way of doing it. It very rarely comes from a bright idea in a dark room in the Cabinet Office. Civil servants are sometimes too clever for their own good, if I could put it like that. More often than not, it comes from the ability to see across a system, to see the stresses and strains in those systems, to understand how through those systems you deliver better outcomes for citizens. And that does require expertise in the generic policy making, but it also helps if you can, or certainly in the team, you have a sufficient expertise in that particular policy area. The younger civil servants I've worked with in Whitehall, their sort of horizons had shrunk to sort of like 18 months or so, which is way too short. And it's very often, it's not just one, it's the churn in the team as a whole that is very debilitating for those who have to interface with the civil service. So I'm all for saying, yep, you come into a job like that, you get up to cruising altitude in about 18 months, and you need to do the job for at least 2.5 years after that.
Mm-hmm. When I was researching ahead of this event, I read a speech by Sir John Kingman, who's a former Treasury Mandarin, I think 2020, and he was talking about the qualities that are looked for in civil servants, I guess at the higher level. And he singled out intellect, the ability to work well with any and all ministers, which necessarily requires pragmatism and deftness, turning on a dime, ingenuity in finding solutions to tricky problems, if only elegantly drafting over the cracks, the ability to engage skillfully with stakeholders without putting a foot in it. But then he points out that what's missing from that is a track record of ever having made anything happen, as opposed to successfully keeping the plates spinning, and that a delivery record is seen as nice to have rather than essential. I don't know if that feeds into what you were saying a bit there, Philip, but there is the good chaps theory that you can come in and...
Yeah, absolutely, undoubtedly, and I think this is certainly it's probably more true in some respects in Whitehall and in the Scottish end of things, but that and Alex will, like me, spent time in the Cabinet Office, will have seen that there's these really, really clever people who sort of burn through the night sky like a comet, throwing sparks all around them, and everybody looks up and thinks, wow, admires, but actually they don't leave anything behind. And that sort of constant reinvention, the clever folk come in, don't take account of what's come before, so reproduce stuff that others have thought through and really don't add a lot of value for the process. And they sort of work it up to the point at which ministers make the announcement. And it sort of plays into that sort of ministerial trait of doing the press release, saying we're going to spend a load of money or something, and then moving on to the next thing. And it breaks the continuity of policy making. Just one other quick point on this. I'm a very strong believer in that the civil service should have a wider range of skills, but the Cummings thing of just sort of focusing on like data experts and so on. What the civil service deals with is human problems at the end of the day, complex human systems, and it's experiencing that sort of thing and the ability to knit together the profile of people who can understand the totality of that problem and work with those who are on the ground trying to deal with these issues that actually moves public policy forward. It's sophisticated stuff. It doesn't lend itself to easy slogans. And I think it's a domain where, dare I say, the Scottish Government still has a long way to go, but Whitehall probably further to get that real understanding of how you make change happen in real lives at the end of the day.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested then in reading up again that some people say the civil service policy machine is quite often divorced from the realities of delivery and the experiences of those who are, I guess, supposed to benefit from it, the customers, the voters, and what can be done to fix that. You see the phrase, the Treasury view, often used, and we've got obviously the current cost of living crisis, and they and their Chancellor could arguably be said to have, not a huge amount of personal experience of poverty or understanding what really matters when you're trying to tackle it as someone at the lower end of the economic scale. Another example might have been the education department in Scotland during lockdown, where I know a lot, did they really understand what parents and children were wrestling with? Did they really stand up behind the system that was struggling so much? How is there a way to close that gap? Again, is it about the kind of people that you're getting? Is it about, Jeremy Haywood, for example, went away to work in the private sector and came back? I know others have done that. I know he wasn't out working on the shop floor, but that sense of just having a much more diverse, in all sorts of ways, intake for the civil service.
Yes, I agree. I absolutely. And like Jeremy, I did a couple of stints in the private sector. Spent a couple of very happy years, unsurprisingly happy years, working for Scottish and Newcastle. So that was a sort of a nice gig to get. But it was a bit like being a mystery shopper, because I was dealing with government relations. So I was looking into government from the outside, and it taught me a huge amount about how business relates to government. And it wasn't all flashing for government, I have to say. But I think that experience, I hope it made me a better civil servant. But I absolutely believe that the civil service, certainly the policy civil service in particular, should draw on a greater variety of skills, background, of experience, not just in terms of different professions, but also geographically. I would make it a rule that you cannot get into the senior civil service, certainly in Whitehall, unless you've had experience in local government, a devolved government, the health service or business. You've had that experience outside of Whitehall. That sort of breaks up, or would help to break up the monopoly of thinking, or the risk of monopolistic sort of thinking you get from a bunch of folk who've had very similar career paths, live in the same part of the world, whose kids go to the same sort of schools and all the rest of it. They just don't have that breadth of life experience that I think brings value to it. Now, again, I'm still not saying, my life experience has been that broad, but at least when I was working in Whitehall, I was still living in Scotland. And so could bring, I talked to different sorts of people, exposed to different media and so on. And that, I think, did, again, help me to do the job I had to do in the Cabinet Office in DEXU.
And Paul, did you? I wonder about Scotland compared to Whitehall, in that there is less of an Oxbridge culture up here. Our politicians are less. There's not a lot of Old Etonians around. There aren't really a lot of Oxbridge graduates around. Our politicians tend to look and sound a bit more like the general population. Is the same thing true in your experience of the Scottish civil service? Is there a different type that is drawn there?
I think it is different, but I suppose my point about diversity is not sufficiently so. I've been looking at some of the questions in the chat. I mean, I think that Philip's experience of working in a completely different sector, in the business sector, the private sector, is hugely important and something we miss out on. I think we could do a lot more of that. I know I would have benefited from it. I think we could draw it in a lot more effectively. I think we need to think hard about our non-executive community, and that's not to criticise what's there at the moment. It's simply to say that I think we could draw much more widely on NHS England, for example, has a board which is, composed entirely of people with different experiences. I think that's quite a strong model that could add value. We then come to the point that Sarah and others have made. Ultimately, the decisions on these things rest with ministers, and so the issue is, can ministers be persuaded that a stronger non-executive presence would make a difference? So, I'm in the luxurious position of being able to say now what my opinion is. My opinion is it would. I think it would add a huge amount of value. I think the way that the public service, not just the civil service, faces towards business could be improved quite considerably. And some of that is not willful. It's just lack of knowledge and understanding, which I think we could do well to grow. Personally, I believe in a national health service in public hands, accountable to Parliament through ministers. That's my view. Other constructs are available. The same is true of the civil service. We've decided to have a civil service of a certain kind. We could decide to have a different kind.
Chris, there's another point I was going to make. I agree with all of what Philip and Paul have said about that, but there's another point I was going to make, which is maybe less technical and more cultural, going back to your original point about how connected are civil servants to people. And there's no doubt that certainly in my experience, there is a very strong cultural expectation of civil servants and that they place on themselves, that they have the answer to every question. And I suppose in some ways they borrow that from, you know, every week the Prime Minister and the First Minister stand up in their respective parliaments and maintain the fiction that they have the answer to every question, which of course they can't possibly do. But that creates a cultural expectation that I think makes it quite hard for civil servants to feel comfortable and confident going out of the confines of the office and saying to people, do you know, I don't really know how this works. Tell me how this works in your bit of the world. And I remember talking to some civil servants in the period immediately after the Brexit vote, when of course we were entering a period of pretty much unprecedented uncertainty, who were expressing real deep anxiety about how to manage relationships with the people that they engaged with in their sector, because they didn't yet have the answers. And it was a real anxiety. It was literally keeping them awake at night. So I think there's something about understanding that. And in my view, that is a huge Achilles heel to the civil service and being effective. But I can understand where it comes from.
Okay. Just given where we are, or digitally where we are, thinking about the Scottish civil service and perhaps how it's changed since devolution, it's inevitably probably become more of its own thing. I'm interested in how it works with Whitehall and what the problems are there and how they might be fixed and what works well in comparison. And you know, it's been an interesting week because we've had a document, first in a series of documents on independence, which clearly been written by the civil service and published, you know, and it's quite a provocative document about the rest of the UK or the performance of the UK. And I'm sort of interested in the role of civil servants writing that, not in any hostile way, just it was a fascinating thing to read and think there are people, you know, who are neutral by profession, who've got to sit down and research this stuff, frame the argument, and then deliver it in a document, which is actually deliberately provocative towards another part of government. But how does that process work for civil servants? Is it a comfortable thing to do? And what is the relationship like, or has it been in practice like, I guess, since devolution first kicked in, to anyone that wants to take that?
Could maybe coming, having sort of worked 20 years in Scotland and then a good 10 years in Whitehall, sort of just seeing it from both ends of the spectrum, is it just worth coming into that question by saying there is an enormous challenge to the civil service north and the south of the border, which wasn't there when I joined. I didn't join quite as early as Paul did, though I think Paul and I are probably more or less the same generation. But that wasn't there in my early career, which is we're in an age of identity politics now, whether we like it or not. And what that has led to in the south, the criticism of the civil service that it's a sort of a hotbed of remainery, has resisted the delivery of the project of Brexit, so that it has been offside. The criticism in the north comes from the other way, that the civil service is too onside, that it's drunk the Kool-Aid, is too close to its political bosses. That is a real risk for the civil service. And the civil service, the model as Paul has described it, that we have of impartiality, is hugely important. The civil service is not tarred by that sort of political brush. And I think anybody outside the civil service who's interested in the governance of the country really needs to be concerned about this. I mean, when I used to say, I said it to the old Brexit minister, you can trash us in the course of this, but don't forget, you've only got one civil service. There isn't another one waiting around the corner to take over if you trash this one. And so unless somebody's going to evolve a different model of a civil service, we have to use and work with the one we've got. And that is worth folk listening to this conversation, thinking quite hard about that, because that matters to us all as citizens. North and South, I mean, this we had a sort of a prelude to all of this, of course, in the Scottish independence referendum, where there's big critique of the white paper that was written by Scottish government civil servants. where Nick Macpherson, the Treasury Permanent Secretary, was highly criticised for releasing advice to ministers. This is, these are difficult times for civil servants to walk those lines, and I think the onus is on civil servants, as we've discussed throughout this seminar, to think hard about the sort of advice they're giving to ministers and to know where to draw the line. It is difficult, I think, for Scottish Government civil servants to, when they have to support what is clearly a campaign for independence, to stay the right side of that line, but equally difficult for civil servants in Whitehall. I have a lot of sympathy for the poor folk who have to write that benefits of Brexit document that came out 2-3 months ago. And these are tough times for civil servants to stay in that impartial space. And ultimately, folk have to follow the conscience, but it's hard going.
Alex.
Yeah, I agree with everything Philip said there, and completely defer to him and others on the sort of particular situation in Scotland. It prompted one thought though about, I think the civil service, there's this sort of, civil servants can't answer back thing when they're criticised, which is true. That is the case. I do think, and again, this is something that I probably wouldn't have said a few years ago when I was inside the civil service, but I think there is an opportunity for the civil service just to be a little bit more muscular and assertive in what it says about itself in public, obviously not in a partial way and not taking sides, and there are risks associated with that, so it needs to be done really, really carefully, but something that does a bit more to explain what the civil service does, why it is as it is, the nature of the advice that it's giving, and a bit more kind of confidence, a bit more of a sort of explaining job. And I personally don't think it would be a problem for the head of the civil service to make a few more sort of public comments and public appearances beyond the odd sort of defensive select committee hearing. I think there's space there for the civil service, and the same would be true of the head of the civil service in Scotland, clearly. To own that argument and that discussion a bit more.
Okay, thank you for that. Listen, we've got 10 minutes left, and I'm really keen to get some questions in rather than hog it myself, though I happily would. So why don't we just run through a few now? Ewan Brown, Ewan, do you want to go first? I think you're muted, Ewan.
Sorry, Chris, the questions are there. I won't repeat them in my statement, but very interested in what Alex Thomas has just said, because although I worked out after a number of years that Paul Gray was in charge of the health service, until I started to frame this question, I had no idea who was running the health service in Scotland. And I questioned whether the bulk of people on this call know the identity of the person that is running the £16 billion business. So I'd be very interested just in the panel's view on both of the little questions that I've posed there.
Well, Paul, you would seem the obvious one to, given it was you.
So, Ewan, first of all, your question is a fair one. So I'm not about to say, oh no, wave my hands, go away, don't ask it. As to whether people should have known who I was, I mean, I was in the newspapers, the print media fairly often. I didn't, as it were, publicise myself, but other people did it for me. And certainly on social media, I was reasonably visible. It's potentially the case that I should and could have done more. I was interviewed on radio and television quite a few times as well. What difference would it have made if people knew who I was? It might have given some more structure and focus. But again, because the Chief Executive of NHS Scotland and the Director General for Health and Social Care are the same job, you're in that situation where the minister is still the minister, and that therefore is respected. In England, and I'm only using this as a for example, they're split. So you have an NHS chief executive and a permanent secretary in the Department of Health. There are advantages and disadvantages in both constructs. I think I've already indicated that I think a greater non-exec input from people with a business background would be extremely helpful. So I'm not disagreeing with that proposition at all. my pushback, if I can do it sort of with a smile on my face and politely, is that I probably knew a few things that people who had run businesses didn't know. So, you know, I had some skills too. And also the job was, and now I'm sounding defensive and I apologize. The job was advertised internationally. Anyone in the whole world could have applied for it. I didn't decide who should be interviewed, nor who should be shortlisted, nor who should be appointed. So there may well have been better people than me. Unfortunately, I'm pretty sure there were. But unfortunately, on the day, you know, I was the guy who got through the process to the end. So do we need a different process? Should we have done it a different way? These would all be legitimate questions to ask. But should
it be a civil servant? Should it be a civil servant that runs this?
My answer is should it definitely not. I mean, if you asked some senior clinicians, they would say they would rather have it run by a doctor or a nurse or somebody else. Now, actually, doctors and nurses did during my tenure get to the place of running health boards, which I think was good progress. But my response would be if we feel we need a different person, we would have to have a different process to get them. And I don't find that an objectionable proposition. But the process is perfectly designed to produce the result it gives you. And unfortunately, I was that result.
I'm quite keen to choose questions that don't just go over the ground that we've covered in the conversation. Nick Kunsberg, you've got a question about non-exec directors, which I think is quite interesting.
I have no idea where we are now, but I think about 15 or 20 years ago, departmental boards were set up for each of the departments, and they invited applicants to join as non-executive directors. The headhunter who, in fact, contacted me after about 6 months when I'd asked him what was happening, he said, well, I've given a list A and a list B, and list B are about to be appointed. And I make the point because my son is an interim director general in London, and he gets huge value out of 2 of the non-executive directors on his departmental board. I'm just interested to know whether that has any impact at all up here.
Sorry.
So I suppose I can maybe just ask Nick's question about Scotland, and then maybe Alex, if your observation on Whitehall, because they are slightly different arrangements. So yes, in Scotland there are non-executives who are appointed. It's a different set of responsibilities from those you would have if you're a non-executive on the board of a company. You don't have any responsibilities or accountabilities. But certainly speaking personally, my experience of having a non-executive buddy was immensely helpful. I had a number of them. They brought very different experiences and perspective, and were able to come along to the audit and assurance meetings that looked at the business of the bit of the government that I was responsible for, and ask those good, external, challenging, thoughtful questions that you don't necessarily ask if you're so close to it. I think one of the key distinctions between the Scottish system and the Whitehall system is that in Scotland, this is entirely the business of the civil service. So it is a civil service who appoints, interviews, selects, and works with the non-executives, whereas in Whitehall, I think I'm right in saying that those are ministerial appointments. But Alex, you'll know more about me than that.
Yeah, that's right, and that has important consequences for them, I think. So, but I mean, to answer Nick's question directly, to have boards made much of a difference? I would say, and I think our research would bear this out, the IFG, no. Have individual non-executives made a difference? In some cases, yes. So I think in Whitehall, boards are very marginal. I mean, they're supposedly chaired by a Secretary of State, but they're not really boards. They're kind of gatherings. They're supposed to meet a few times a year, bit of a talking shop. I think there is value in some of the kind of more formal aspects of that, running the rule on the risk register and some of the sort of auditing aspects, but really the action is with ministers taking policy decisions, and then with the senior executive team that Philip can speak to better than I can, who are running the department. But then on individual non-executives, I think there are some who make real differences. Interesting to see Henry Dimbleby all over the news on a food strategy, who's driven a whole plank of government policy, even though the review aspects of it haven't been accepted. But there is a bit of a risk, I think, and Michael Gove has a tendency to do this in particular, of using those, because as Sarah said, they're ministerial appointments, as sort of bonus advisors or extra special advisors, which isn't really what they're for. They're there to bring commercial project delivery experience, to provide assurance to the Secretary of State and the Permanent Secretary on that. But I mean, there are some very active, very effective NEDs.
Just two very quick thoughts. The job description is wrong. They're not non-exec directors. There's nothing to do. Director Sarah said. Just needless to say, when I had a board with non-execs on it at the Department for Exits in the EU, my triumph was to keep my 3 Secretaries of State sequentially as far from that as absolutely possible. Those non-execs were very helpful to me, but the board itself was I think better off being run by them and me rather than anybody else. So that's all the only comment I'd make on that.
That's yes, Minister in practice, isn't it? I like it. Just one last question I think we've got time for. And Richard, I think it's Richard Simpson probably looking at the question. You're talking about managing cross-departmental issues, and the issue of silos and the lack of joined-up thinking is something that's often been the case. Do you want to say something?
Yes, I mean, there are so many issues that are absolutely cross-cutting. Children was the one that I mentioned. And I sat on a committee that met every 3 months in the 14, 15 months I was a minister. And it was totally ineffectual, completely ineffectual, because no one actually then drove through any of the stuff that was going on. And there are so many of these issues, and I just wondered how the panelists saw dealing with that. I mean, in Whitehall, it must be an absolute total nightmare, but it's still not very good in a Scottish context.
Yes, so I suppose I've got both a kind of prior and a current interest in that, working for an organisation that is dedicated to trying to understand how you can deliver outcomes better, and outcomes by definition can very rarely be delivered by any one part of government alone. And I think the reality is, as you know, Richard, it is very, very hard. And I think, for me, I think there's something pretty fundamental about the incentives and the rewards baked into existing structures, so that although we've had somebody else commented in the chat, we've had a national performance framework now in Scotland since 2007, designed to enable government to come together around these cross-cutting outcomes. And yet, even in a setting where in many ways we've got a framework that's world leading, the gap between the theory and the reality of that is still great. And a lot of that is because there is such a strong incentive and reward system to be very vertical, to be responding to what your minister is singly accountable for, and what almost what it says in the tin of the job description. I don't think it's beyond wit to re-engineer that, but it requires some very deliberate re-engineering and very high degree of commitment throughout the whole system. And by the whole system, I mean outside the core civil service as well, working with agencies right across the public services, third sector, civil society, etc., in order to join people up around what needs to be done. So, and for me, I would say that's one of the most urgent challenges of the next few years, particularly as there's less money and it becomes all the more critical that people are focusing on what matters.
Anyone else want to add to that? No? Nope. Okay, well, that's us had our hour. We arguably bit off more than we could chew in an hour. I think it's such a big subject, and there's so many interesting little alleys and alleyways that we could go down. I'm sorry for some of the questions we didn't get to, just trying to keep the range broad. But thanks again to today's guests, Philip, Sarah, Paul and Alex, for lending us their time and expertise. Utterly fascinating, and it's been really insightful, and I think it leaves us all with a lot to think about. So we're very grateful for their time. I'll just let people who are Regular guests know that our next event is next Wednesday. We'll have Gideon Rachman, the FT's foreign affairs expert, who'll be talking about his new book, The Age of the Strongman. So we hope you can come to that as well, and that it's every bit as interesting as today has been. So thanks again, and no doubt we'll return to the subject, hopefully with some of these guests again as well. And thank you for your time as well, people. Cheers.